say first, I really am glad to be here. The lecture last night, it was difficult because I had no idea of the mix in the audience. I mean, there was sort of some academics, some students, but mainly sort of unwashed public from the area, and I didn't quite know at what level. Very washed. Yes, but it was clearly it was gratifying that there were so many there, and I was very impressed by the mix of questions, and I was especially glad they were so well compared, and also I was glad that the questioners did take up the various different threads, because I'd intentionally covered a whole lot of very different topics, and sometimes you do that and the question just on one thing, but there were questions on things from the cosmology to the world population and all that, which was good. Just a word about the book, and I'm very glad that the sales have been multiplied hugely by the fact that people here have bought copies. The book originated in my giving the BBC Rees Lectures, which are an annual event where you give lectures, 4 lectures, which are only half an hour, and they're given in different places for public audience and the questions afterwards. And they appeared on the web, but I was asked to produce a book which was slightly expanded, and so the book is actually twice as long as the lectures. It's as though I gave 4 one-hour lectures. But I should apologize for the book in a number of ways. The first is that each lecture had to be sort of fairly self-contained, and that therefore meant that there was a bit of overlap, and the order was not as it would have been had I just written the book straight through. And also intentionally, the book touched a lot of bases. I was asked not to talk primarily about science, but I did say some things about my interest in science in one of the lectures and in the limits of science, etc. But I drew a bit on my experiences of being president of Royal Society, which is our Academy of Sciences, and the Canadians are members of it too. This brought me in touch with many of the societal aspects of science, and I have been involved quite a bit in that through the House of Lords and my university work, etc. And so it was really a book which addressed various issues about science itself, about the way in which in coming decades we're going to have to cope with problems where science is part of the solution, and the problems that that is going to cause. And also I said quite a bit about the interaction of scientists with politicians and the wider public. This is an issue which is important for all of us, and of growing importance, because science impinges on a bigger and bigger fraction of the decisions politicians have to make. More of those decisions are long-term, etc. And it's important to involve scientists both as experts and as citizens. And it's important that scientists make the distinction between when they're speaking as experts and when they're speaking just as citizens, representing their views on the ethics and economics of the issue rather than the science itself. So I really tried to cover a whole lot of bases, and I hope that at least bits of it were found interesting, stimulating to readers, and I'd be delighted to talk about any issues that were raised, and particularly anything where you thought I was completely off the mark.
Can I jump in first, since I'm moderator? That issue about science engagement with the public, of course, is my job. And Harvey was lamenting last night that when the National was doing a science story, why are they calling on Bob McDonald and not Harvey to do it? Why aren't the scientists themselves there? Which is a perfectly valid question. And my response to that is very often, and even on Quirks and Quarks, we have a huge attrition rate of stories that don't make it to air because the scientists cannot communicate. Of all the stories we do on Quirks, more than 50% don't make it to air because the producers get on the phone before they're even talking to me at all, and we can tell right away that this is not a good storyteller, because there's a good story, good storyteller. We need both in our job to make it palatable for the public. And so story tells. And Sir Martin raised this in the book, that there's a real need here for people beyond me to be talking to the public, and that there's a gap there between the connection with the public and the scientists.
In the spirit of vigorous debate, can we jump in and just because I think that that's a really interesting question, but also it's a question about to what extent the public can actually be educated, the different ways in which the public can be educated. And in a sense, that what the CBC may be doing is expecting there to be this kind of interesting story. It has to be told in a certain way, but perhaps we also need to expect the public to be more attuned to different ways of dealing with scientific questions. In other words, that they need to know that in order to understand a particular kind of scientific question, it's not going to be at the level of, you know, a good story with a tagline that can be told in 30 seconds. So I think that also science education has a role to play here, and it may be different in Canada, it may be different in the UK, it may be different in Brazil, it may be different in India. That is the sort of the vernacular understanding of science, which I would be interested to know a little bit more about as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree with you, and I also agree with Bob that only a minority of scientists are able to communicate in a clear way, and that's why I very much admire scientific journalists, because they are expected to mug up some topic which they may not know about at all, and present it in radio. Even worse, if they have to stand in front of a camera and talk without hesitation, deviation or repetition for 2 minutes on a particular topic. So it's a very rare skill. I think we should admire that. I think most scientists don't realize how difficult that is. But of course, it would be easier if the public had a bigger feel for science. We can't expect them to be experts, but the fact that the public knows so little does obviously mean there is a gap. And well, it came up last night. I mean, something can be, but the Higgs, for instance, I don't think you can expect anyone to understand the Higgs unless they're an expert, except just in the general terms that this is an important discovery which completes a jigsaw which has been developing for 30 years in this field. Whereas other sciences can be explained a bit more clearly, I would say. But I think it's very important for us as scientists to engage, and we need people like Bob as expositors and as intermediaries. And I think there is a role actually for what you might call scientific critics. These are people who aren't researchers but follow the subject well enough and that they can be informed commentators in particular areas. Certainly in the UK there are some people like this in medical science, and they're very valuable, especially, in fact, there's a guy called Ben Goldacre who does this, and he's just, for instance, produced a book on the really disgraceful way in which drug companies suppress contrary evidence and hype up their drugs and that sort of thing. You know, it's very good to have people like that who are not in the field but are close enough to it to be able to comment in an informed way.
He does the column Bad Science.
He does, but he produced a book just out, which is on the way in which the major drug companies distort the presentation of clinical trials and, in effect, get their PR people to write papers and then pay a scientist to have their name on it, and things like this. I mean, other people probably know more about this, but there is it is a disgraceful situation, and it needs people like him to draw attention to it.
Absolutely. I've spent half my life doing science communication, starting out as a scientist. And it's very interesting, because first of all I should say, and I think Bob would agree, that things are improving.
Yeah.
This new generation are much better communicators and much more, despite what we read of people specializing too early, I think much more worldly. In relationship to science and society, relationship to science integrated into culture, which is why I got involved, and also because my chair thought I had the communication ability and I really should do both. I was given the absolute cold shoulder by most of my colleagues. It was as if I wasn't doing it. It didn't exist. And I was doing some pretty high-profile work, CBC Radio, CTV National News. Those are two major outlets in this country. Until our Nobel Prize winner, Michael Smith, who is from your country, Blackpool boy, greengrocer's son, came up to me one day coming out of the swimming pool and said, "You're Sid Katz. You do those things on radio. I think they're wonderful." It was the same week that the Dean of Medicine tried to shut me down because I wasn't an MD. Even though I'm a pharmacologist and knows a little bit about science. It was really quite something. Bob and I have talked about this over the years. Bob comes at it a very different way. He started out in a science center in Toronto because he was keen and interested, and that's so important. And learning, how to take that interest and then putting it into a form. I don't know if you've seen his work. Is phenomenal. I mean, the audience is huge and getting there. So I think my point is that once we learn more about the fact that science, what you're interested in, what a lot of us are interested in, really is part of our lives, and we have to understand it in order to make the proper decisions, then it becomes less of something that you may or may not shy away from, and that more people can communicate more easily. In terms of Harvey, one of the things we have to overcome is being an expert in an area as opposed to being a learned person who can comment or develop arguments. I've never believed in this expert area unless it was something that required, as you just said, some of the areas, for example, of your work, you have to understand the basis. But the ultimate thing is, how is that affecting me? How is that affecting the next discoveries that will go on? And that doesn't require absolute experts to respond.
No, I mean, you can be a scholar of a broader field. But I think another point is that apart from the practical impact of science on so many parts of our lives, it is part of our culture. It's the one truly global culture. And Darwin and all the rest of it, and cosmology. And I think rather than bemoaning the fact that the public doesn't care about science, I find it gratifying that so many people are interested in aspects of science which are completely irrelevant to everyday life. I mean, well, kind of cosmology, Darwin, dinosaurs, all these things fascinate a wide public, and you have lots of stories about all these. People are interested just because they are fascinating, they help us to see our place in the world, and it's a mistake to think that people are only interested in something which is directly relevant to their health.
Or it's culturally integrated.
Yeah, culture is important as well.
Martin, just to follow up that for a second, I'm glad to see Ernest here too, because I think the problem is that scientists don't take theater courses. What is it? No, I'm serious.
It's a huge problem.
I mean, we don't do a good enough job of projecting to the public. And why don't we? We don't because you're not trained to do it. I mean, some grad student goes on CBC, if Bob will let him on, and has had no training in communicating an idea to the public.
I should perhaps explain, first of all, my apologies that I was traffic and all that. I'm in the Department of Theatre and Film. My research is actually on investigating the strategies and the methods that artists, filmmakers, theatre makers, and critics use to produce meaning about the culture that's out there. And the discussion that's going on here seems to be, to me, very similar. My interest in joining this discussion is to learn about the strategies of communication, you can call it, but I'd rather call it meaning making, that scientific critics and scientific citizens use in parallel or perhaps in opposition to the ones that film critics or art critics or people generally interested in the arts would use. Science has a much more solid reputation than the arts, or definitely than theatre and film as forms of entertainment. But the one advantage that theatre and film has is that it's a topic of discussion on the bus, and people don't feel they need to be experts in order to have a conversation about it. And that was my interest for joining this debate here.
We were talking about this last night, about if you want to look at effective communication with science, look at the very well-funded, highly organized climate deniers, creationists, and conspiracy theorists. No, they're very good at what they do. Much better than the scientists themselves. They're focused, they select the data they're going to put out, they confuse the public, and they say, here's our agenda. They're models of communication. It's just that the message that they're putting out has an agenda to it. And science is failing in exactly that, which is why people believe them more than they believe in
the
science.
rhetorics that those people use are very similar to the ones that
it's
art
good
critics
theater.
and film critics
It's good film, good theater.
I have a question. Why is it that CBC TV on the news never interviews scientists?
But we were talking about this.
I mean,
Why is that?
in countries like the UK or the Netherlands or France, many others, they go straight to the scientists when they want to find out about the science.
Well, on Quirks, that's all we do. So
I know, but I'm talking about TV.
Television, they will if they can find a scientist who can speak. We were just talking about this.
I
But,
suspect there are a lot of them. It's just
and there are a lot who can't. But because they'll call me up, they will actually be on the phone with the scientist. And I'll have somebody from the National say, here's the story, do you know about this story? And we just talked to the person and we haven't got a clue what he said, or she said. Can you interpret this? And can you do it in a minute and a half?
the only
That's
time
the
I ever
difference.
saw a scientist interviewed on CBC News, and it was a 15-second slot to John Polanyi after the death of Francis Crick. And they obviously took a long discussion with him, and they extracted one thing,
Right.
which was that the discovery of DNA, the structure of DNA, had made a lot of medical advancements possible.
I hate news. Okay. I'm a guest on the news. I don't make the news. So but I agree. There is a problem. There is a
But
problem.
there are stories and there are stories, and ultimately where scientists can make a huge contribution is not necessarily in the bullets that are on the national news. It's more to do with the features and really how again you integrate some of these important stories with what is going on, and also other aspects. You always go from what somebody knows to the next step. You can't go from just total oblivion to trying to quote educate or communicate. And I'd like your advice on that, Sir Martin. I think that there have been some wonderful programs, particularly out of the BBC. Thank God you guys figured it out and we didn't, that everybody pays a television license and gets 4 times more
He does
television.
documentaries. We have the doc zone. We've got
Absolutely,
so we do
but
documentaries.
the newer series, for example, the nature series with Sir David Attenborough, these are wonderful. So, what is your comment on that in terms of features versus news?
I said the only television I watch is the politics and the wildlife. That's my two. But no, they are wonderful. But I think what you say is very important. And I mentioned it in my book that the place of science is in feature articles, not in the news headlines, because it gives a misleading impression of science to think it advances by breakthroughs that are made in a single day. I mean, obviously, sometimes an artificial headline is made when a paper is published or something, but we know very well that any discovery emerges gradually over a lot of work.
We do know from the attendance last night and from the enthusiasm around your lectures is that there is an appetite in the public for something more than a 30-second clip,
yes,
right?
yes. And the other thing I wanted to say is that, of course, blogging, etc., is new. That's a way in which you can actually get lots of information and lots of interesting debate. And I think someone was saying earlier that scientists are better at communicating. I think this is because many of them write more. I mean, I think if I look back to when I was a student doing maths and physics, I hardly wrote a sentence, as part of my work. I was unusual in being able to type, whereas all young people, whatever subject they're doing, they may not be very literate, but at least they type and they send messages and all that. And so people are more fluent, if not more eloquent, in being able to express themselves. And there are these vehicles like blogs, which I think are increasingly important in science. And when I was talking to the students earlier, I was saying that perhaps the era of the scientific paper as the basic unit may be over almost, because perhaps publication is going to happen in other ways, and criticism in blogs and things of that kind will play a bigger role. But I think communication is better, as you were saying.
But isn't it true, and I don't know, Bob, if you heard this, but when the new editor, I guess hopefully he's still there, of Science came on, he said, I'm going to read every submission that looks like it's going to be published. If I can't understand it, I'm going to go back to the writers and have them rewrite the article. Science now is much more readable than it ever was before. But it comes back, and again, I think we should put this on the table too, and you alluded to this, that there's so many avenues of information. that come out. Thank God we have a wonderful national news, because otherwise nobody would watch it. Imagine watching Fox News every night, being being subjected to that. At least the national does digging, and they do have stories that are relevant and also are very well presented. But in terms of finding information, that's one of my dilemmas in the health sciences. There's so much misinformation. I am such a bore at a cocktail party, because everybody who is on this vitamin thing and a diet thing, and I have to say, look, Protestantism is correct. Moderation, do this, do that. Oh, he's so boring, So what do you feel about that? I mean, how do we steer people into information that really is relevant?
Well, I think this is the problem, and talk about climate science, for instance. You look on the internet, and you find all these views, and similarly for medicine and any subject. And the public really doesn't know how to discriminate. They need some sort of portal or some sort of advice. And the question is, what are the bodies that can most effectively provide that sort of quality control or assessment? Because, as I mentioned last night, if you've got some disease, you don't look at everything on the web, you value the opinion of someone who's got credentials in the subject. And the analogue of that approach has to be followed when it's climate or environment or GM crops or things of that kind. And it is, as you say, it's the huge volume of information which the average person can't be expected. And that's all the more reason why we need these sort of communicators and critics who can mediate between the scientific community and the professional journals and the public. And I guess someone who goes from the professional journals to you, it's got to be some intermediate person who's familiar with the subject but can digest it.
The portal.
I feel myself between. Yes.
I find it interesting that when the physical, biological, and engineering scientists talk, they exclude other disciplines from the domain of science. A lot of the speculation on a lot of what we're talking about in terms of how to educate and communicate really falls into kind of behavioral and social science disciplines, and the concept of science isn't really inclusive. I thought in your book you're wonderfully inclusive in terms of the Mandela or whatever it was, where the complexity of human behavior is introduced, and I'm just wondering why we don't have more conversations in which we talk about social and behavioral science as important and contributing.
But I thought there's more, isn't there?
Feature of this. Pardon me?
I would have thought on the whole there's more in the general media.
I read about it every day.
Yes,
It really is there. So risk and uncertainty and the decision sciences are very central to your book.
Yes.
We had Dan Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize for his work in that area. At this university, a lot of the seminal work was done while he was here. So.
No, I mean that's important, and one thing the public really does need to have is some assessment of risks, and they're very important. I mean, one point I didn't have time to make last night is that I think the public frets too much about some risks like carcinogens in food, low radiation levels, train crashes and things like that, but is in denial about potentially more serious risks, the low probability, high consequence events, of which the analogue was the financial crash. Things of that kind could happen, and there are some risks which are so serious that even though they're improbable, we should worry about them, because if the event happens even once, that's too often. I think to get people to have a feel for relative risks would be very important, and that is the Kahneman book is very good on that.
A wonderful book. Thinking fast and slow. Endorse that.
Fear and paranoia seems to be rampant, at least in North America. It's really, people are afraid of everything. They're afraid of GM crops, they're afraid of nuclear energy, if we have to go back to it. I think so. And I just wonder about your take on that.
Well,
Reading the Vancouver Sun this morning, Dan Gardner, your Ottawa science columnist colleague, talked about negativity bias, and he's got a wonderful little book on uncertainty, and he really picks up on what Kahneman had to say. So the negativity bias, that's what attracts readers, you know, if it, if it bleeds.
If it bleeds, it leads.
It leads, that's it. I'm trying to use that particular phrase.
Yes,
So
but
we can
GM crops
understand
is an
that.
extreme example of that, isn't it? Where there have been one or two dubious claims of damage, but but huge benefits to for the yield of crops in Africa and things like that.
Yeah. But that's a good example, though, that story, because I use that a lot too when I speak, in terms of other elements besides the science, not just the fear aspect, but also the economic aspect, the usury aspect, the fact that very few companies who happen to be American and huge and have exploited other parts of the world over the years, am I using my words carefully here, are involved in this area. And that becomes almost central to the story. Sentence 2, when you're talking to somebody about GMOs, is not as much about the science as it is about the fact that somebody is owning my genes or whatever. Quite right. If you look at the list of what's possible, if the science is correct, then these can be great advances. But then psychologically, are we playing God? Is somebody making money on this? Become issues that are as key as the science. So you can't separate the science from the issues and the elements.
Well, you can understand the issues and those other elements better if you apply scientific discipline to understanding them. And if we can control anything at this stage of the game in clinical psychology or psychiatry, it's irrational fears. There are technologies.
But now we're back to where we were before, about the best way to beat that fear is through education and understanding the science. If you understand the science behind it, that will quell the fear, and that's not there. People, there's a lot of misconception and misinformation out there.
But I think we're ahead of what we were. I hate to be the non-revisionist here, but I've been at this for so many years. I think that in the 60s and 70s, when there was an issue on fisheries, or there was an issue in forestry, we rarely ever got the light of day from the people at the bench or people who were involved in this and going to the next step. Should we have diversified forests? Should we whatever? Now, there are a lot more people that come out and they're not able to be bridled or saddled, if you will, with information that the public then has to integrate. But I think the portal idea is very important. If you have programs such as the Nature of Things, such as the National News, that's our science, very good science and I guess society program, then at least there is a backdrop, there's a dialogue, and this is why I think that this whole idea of features become important. It's almost like taking a half course, you know, in science and society, which a lot of universities now do. But coupled to this discussion we're having today, we're a two-part huge series in the Globe and Mail about how we're failing as educators in terms of what we are providing to our young people who happen to make it past, let alone K-12 being abysmal in many areas of teaching science and society. But those who make it are specializing way too early. Even business people can't use these individuals because they're not worldly enough or don't have the concept. So what about that and how it relates to science understanding?
Well, I mean, I think in Britain we are probably about the worst in having excessive over-specialisation. I mean, as I said, the quality of the education is not very good, but even for the good people, then they specialise at age 16, as you know, and then in universities they often do just one subject for 3 years. And I think that sort of career in education is too specialised, even for the very motivated academic students. And it's certainly completely inappropriate. Now we have 30 or 40% of the cohort going to a university. So I really think that we can, we should have a broader curriculum. And in the UK, there's a debate about whether to have something like a baccalaureate and not what we call A-levels, etc. And even there's a whole lot of backsliding. People don't want to abandon the system. And the universities actually are unhelpful because they want to have people who are well prepared and can get to a degree in 3 years, and so they they encourage schools to focus on a few areas. So I think we are trapped in a very suboptimal situation in that respect. We need to have a broader curriculum, certainly up to age 18. And I would have thought, I don't know what happens here, but to expose everyone to a few basic common courses. Does that happen here?
I mean, the system here is potentially much better.
Because yes.
When a student does an undergraduate degree here,
yes.
they're supposed to take courses from a variety of faculties.
That's good. Yeah.
Probably it doesn't work as well as it should, but it works. There's potentially much more breadth.
Yes.
So Harvey, for example, I think teaches a course which is called Astronomy for Historians. Right? That's what you call it.
For poets.
Okay.
Yes. Because astronomy is a very good subject.
Historians have never heard of it.
Yes. Yeah.
So Paul, I was thinking perhaps we should change tack a little bit. I mean, we have a distinguished panel.
Yes.
Panel here.
Yes. Sorry.
I just want to comment. I'm glad that my colleagues see progress. This may be a somewhat parochial comment, but recently one of our legal scholars gave us a presentation on 2012 as the nadir of environmental science in British Columbia. She documented the suppression of all opposition and environmental activism by government scientists who are told they must not speak about their science. I think that it's an extremely urgent situation, and I think the progress that has been made is in danger of being lost completely.
In that area.
A short while ago, the group of us were in Ottawa protesting. I mean, it's unbelievable that the respectable scientists who were walking across the hill with placards protesting the suppression of science in the government research labs.
Well, this does sound very worrying, and it's rather like what happened in the Bush administration in the US, I think in climate science, and that was reversed by the Obama administration with John Holdren, etc. So it does sound very worrying. I'm very concerned about this in the UK context, where I think we handle these things better. And in fact, the reason I'm wearing my suit is not for you, but because as soon as I get off the plane to London, I go straight to the House of Lords for a debate on scientific advice to government. We have a system in the UK now of having a chief scientist in every government department. And this is someone who is seconded normally from academia or sometimes from industry for 3 to 5 years. They are people with credentials and good contacts, and they are listened to. Not always enough, but this is a step in the right direction, I think, that we have these people in departments. There are procedures whereby the government or their minister needn't take their advice, because the minister obviously has to take into account other criteria than just the science. But we are very concerned that the scientists shouldn't be muzzled, and that if they disagree, then if the minister disagrees, then he has to say publicly why he disagrees with scientific advice, as a safeguard against this sort of thing happening.
Whereas in our country, as soon as our current Prime Minister took office, he got rid of the Science Advisory, one of the first things he did. So it's a serious issue.
I mean, Canada has never had a serious commitment. I mean, it's the only advanced country in the world that doesn't have a minister responsible for science and technology.
Yeah, we did.
There have been. When?
We have had them in the past.
You've had Minister of Industry, but no Minister for Science and Technology.
Back in the 80s.
We've had
It was
part
not
of
a
the
minister.
secretaries of science.
I was going to say that, I mean, in Britain, the channels of communication are open between scientists and government. And you'd be surprised, I think, in Canada to find there is absolutely no way for a scientist to talk, for a distinguished scientist to communicate with the government. The doors are closed. You can wave a banner outside the office, but that's it. And it's really remarkable.
They can't speak to me either. We've had refusals.
Yeah.
To talk to the prime scientist who wrote the paper. And they said, no, I'm not allowed to speak. Or the Prime Minister's office says that's inappropriate. And we've had to go to a secondary author or have somebody comment. That's happened more than once in our show. I just wondered if we wanted to change to other topics, if there are other issues that anyone wanted to bring up.
Well, we have a panel here that's prepared some discussion points at least. So Martin, would you like to?
Okay, so I mean, the thing I was going to ask about relates to some of the things which have come out already. I was going to read out something from which you wrote in your first talk, where you say, we all need a feel for how much confidence can be placed in science's claims. And then you go and talk on, I think, a bit about quality control in science. And I'm a mathematician, I work in probability theory. I don't quite work in statistics, but I've become aware of statisticians who are becoming extremely concerned about the reliability of the scientific literature. And this is particularly the case in the biomedical area. And I've got various, I mean, I guess there are two questions which we can ask. Is there evidence about unreliability? And if the literature is unreliable, does it matter? So I've got various pieces of evidence which I perhaps won't bother to read out, but roughly speaking, one might say anecdotal evidence suggests that about 50% of journal articles in the biomedical area are just wrong.
50%?
Something like that. I mean, it might be a third, a quarter, might be 50%, but something of that sort. There's a particular example, Bayer, evil drug company still, 67 in-house attempts to replicate published research, and less than 1/4 of the cases did replicate. So, huge problem perhaps in the biomedical area.
Yes.
Does it matter?
Well, I think very much, and we're saying, and this new book by Ben Goldacre does document just cases like that, where negative results are never published, and so you get biased publication anyway, and the positive ones are written by the PR people. That's a real worry, and I think it has very serious consequences. There was a case of some drug based on monoclonal antibodies where 6 people nearly died, and apparently there had been a previous test on one person who got very ill, and that was never published. You know, they tried to suppress it. And well, I mean, you know far more about this than me, but I think in the biomedical areas where we have these big, rich companies, there is a problem. But of course, away from biomedical areas, there is lots of sort of sloppy research in some areas and occasional sort of, if not fraud, at least data enrichment. There was the Mark Hauser case recently and things like that.
I mean, I think I'm not sure where the unreliable papers are. I think it may be not just scientists associated with companies, but the academic and medical scientists are all part of a culture of bad statistics and unreliability.
But is this because of bad science, or is it intentional? I mean, why is this happening?
Well, the statisticians who perhaps have got a vested interest in it say that, you know, you do an experiment, then you sort of torture the data to get out a significant result. And most biomedical research of statistics is a kind of afterthought. You have to be careful to do statistics accurately. The easiest thing to do is you get your data, and then the general tradition in the biomedical area is 5% significance means you can publish the results. But if you look at 20 different hypotheses with your data, then one of them is going to come out significant.
Yeah. My prof used to say, if you can't see it, don't do statistics on it. Just throw it up. And the other thing, Bob, is that at the bench, you have to be very careful to include everything and not just the ones that look like they're going in a specific trend. But how is all this going to change, or will it change, when we change the method by which we publish? You know, publishing now is changing.
Yes,
so,
yes. Well, I mean, I think if publication is done in a way where there can be sort of comments like Amazon book reviews but not anonymous, that would help. But I think the worries we have are not just the commercial pressure in the drug companies, but frankly the career pressures in academia. And of course there have been these high profile cases of fraud, and we see it at the extreme from what I read about China, you know, where there have been cases of fraud, but they get a big financial bonus if they publish a paper in a Western journal and things like that, and there's a lot of plagiarism and all that, you know. So I think there is a problem which is perhaps more under our control of ensuring that there's not an unhealthy kind of competition and pressure within academia. And I think, I do worry very much about the culture in academia, which is, I think, frankly, making things less pleasant for young academics than it was when I was a young academic. It was strong pressure. Well, let me give one example from close to my own field. And this is just an issue of how academia manages. I had to write a letter on behalf of a postdoc I'd worked with who was up for tenure at an American university. And this candidate had produced, as part of her document, a histogram of number of citations over the last few years, plus also similar histograms for 6 other people who the candidate considered were sort of competitors or comparable, you know. And the fact that people are sort of in their career sort of counting citations and comparing themselves in this way, especially given that citations are so patchy and you can get huge numbers in some fields and not in others. But I think this is this and the scrubbing for grants is making academia certainly less attractive, but I suspect also less efficient, because these are all displacement activities from what people should actually be doing. And to some extent, this is in our hands. I mean, we've got to do all we can, I would have thought, to ensure that people don't feel pressure to do this, and to make it clear that when choices have to be made about who to appoint to posts and things like that, other criteria are used rather than these inappropriate surrogates.
Yeah. I mean, wouldn't the simplest answer to your question be that people will do this if the benefits outweigh the possible? And when citations are introduced, there are lots of ways that people can augment their citations without doing something of quality.
Yes.
And I mean, you know, the most celebrated cases of scientific fraud have usually involved companies where the benefit is monetary, right?
Yes.
But once you introduce...
But the pressure on careers is also pretty strong.
Yeah. Maybe they should get rid of citations. The new currency.
Yeah.
Levis, did you want to
You have a long... I'll make it shorter. I'm noticing I have a few scribbles here.
Well, Dr. Rees did ask for some negative comment, or at least some criticism.
Yes,
so I do have some of those. I begin with lots of praise, lest God forbid I be accused of it. But I mean, the importance of openness to science is as important, I think, as it is for liberal democratic societies, of course. The acknowledgement that science policy involves ethics, economics, and social policies. The virtue of scientific engagement with larger concerns. You cite Joseph Rotblat and Pugwash conferences, which of course are exemplary. Problems of population growth, climate change, and the challenges these pose at the international level, something in respect to which Canada has been no bargain these last 5 or 10 years, as we know. And then a whole series of very lucid questions on page 73. Will richer countries recognize it's in their self-interest for the developing world to prosper? Can the focus of our concerns become more broadly international? Can our institutions prioritize projects that are long-term in perspective, even if a mere instant in the history of the planet? And finally, I agree with something you brought up again last night, the need for coexistence between science and religion while fending off fundamentalist challenges. Very important point. There are a few areas where I would voice my disagreement. Okay. First, on page 60, this is the danger of going into print after event. As a political scientist, I know all about that problem. You entered into that domain. Page 60, you write, the political response to the 2009 financial crisis may offer encouragement. Who would have thought 3 years ago that the world's financial system would have been so transformed that big banks were nationalized? You write on page 60. This reads poorly in 2012. As we look back at the Euro crisis, American gridlock, and the remarkable success of the very banks and investment houses that helped precipitate the 2008 global financial crisis coming out on top. So, the second, here I'm actually going to be in a bit of disagreement with my colleague from psychology, Ken. You talk about the different sciences occupying successive levels of a tall building with economics occupying the penthouse. These days, it's the investment bankers and hedge fund specialists who occupy the penthouse. I don't think it's the economists. But more to the point, the claims of economics to be an exact science with all the, that's actually picking up on Martin's point, yeah, with all the mathematical and statistical apparatus to accompany this has been significantly devalued. Now, I happen to not be a monarchist, but I must acknowledge a shrewd comment from the current reigning monarch of the UK and Canada back in 2008 when she opened that wing of the London School of Economics. In the fall of 2008, and she said, "How come you hadn't predicted this?" All the august LSEers. How come indeed? Economics remains much closer to the humanities than most practicing economists would be prepared to admit. The same would be true for my own discipline of political science. In fact, the older designation, which was still found occasionally in the UK and occasionally in Canada, political studies, is much closer to the truth. Third point, there's an optimistic tone that's changing gear to the comments you make about possible future contact with extraterrestrials. This is a whole other topic. I wonder, the pre-Socratic philosopher Anaxagoras once commented, if horses could conceive of gods, they would take the form of horses. This is when the Greeks were the human version of the gods. Cultural anthropology would make me cautious about how much meaningful communication could occur between humans or human-created robots and outer space aliens. I think we'd more likely to see two one-way streams rather than one two-way stream. I'm not sure that's my suspicion. On another point, which actually has to do with universities in the broadest sense, I think there's a certain complacency that creeps into your comments about higher education and the domination of Anglo-American institutions. There is a bias, I think, in the rating agencies, the Times Higher Education Supplement, the Shanghai, all of that, towards English language institutions, and came up with, think of the International Citation Index and how it works. And if it isn't in English, forget it. Much as the American dollar as a world reserve currency has enjoyed the privileges of what economists call seigniorage, the benefits of being a reserve currency, so have English language universities, given the role that English has come to play internationally. But are they all they're cracked up to be? And are continental European or East or South Asian universities always that inferior? To be sure, the American Ivy Leagues are, with their huge endowments and relatively small undergraduate bodies, fare exceptionally well by any international comparison. Though in terms of their ability to train large numbers of students, both in the sciences and all other disciplines, they lag far behind most public institutions. And some of the best of these, the California system, for example, that you cite, as we know, is currently being starved of funds, so there's always that problem. Related to this in a different way, competition can be a useful thing where universities are concerned. But we need to be careful how far we take this when it comes to forging ties with major corporate interests in the search for the golden calf. Now, we know of the threats to academic freedom historically, Galileo, the church, that. The threat that comes from political masters, and not only in authoritarian regimes, to academic institutions. But the same is true of powerful corporate interests, which are interested in harnessing science to their own ends. And isn't it an odd coincidence? I cite the title of a recently published book in Britain by a science writer, Ben Goldacre, Bad Farmer. same sort. In other words, the story applies to us, the dangers. Finally, and this is a quite different point, the last chapter deals with globalization, right? And this is the term, and it has to do with nomenclature and terminology. The term globalization runs throughout the chapter, and God knows Giddens and others have run away with it before. The term has, of course, become something of a cliche in our day and age. Everybody talks about globalization, referring to economic arrangements that span continents, cultural trends, unifying political currents, and much besides. Now, you make the interesting observation, apropos Einstein's theory of relativity, that maybe it would have been better called theory of invariance. Nomenclature can matter. Now, for many in the contemporary world, the notion of globalization takes the form of a runaway bulldozer, sweeping local customs, cultures, political institutions, economies onto the slag heap. That's the negative side of it. Globalization does not have a warm, fuzzy ring to it. That's the least I can say, nor should it, since so much of it has been top-down rather than bottom-up. I would suggest that the term cosmopolitan and cosmopolitanism has potentially greater appeal. Certainly to communities of scientists, environmentalists, engaged citizens. Its roots go back to the Stoics in the 3rd century BC. It speaks to a worldview that is perfectly compatible with continuing to be citizens of both nation states and local communities while engaging in issues that go well beyond this. I think that would be a better word for us to use than globalization. Anyway, voila, my reflections on what I found a very thought-provoking book from one of the leading scientists of our day, and I'll add, having listened to your lecture last night, someone with a very engaging sense of humor.
Can I respond? Can I say I agree with at least 90% of what you've just said? I think the first point you made was what I said about the banks. Now, I completely agree. It was not nearly enough and it didn't work. But it was more than... It was still surprising. If you'd asked people beforehand, would the banks be nationalised? It was clearly not enough. And I agree with you about economics not being a quantitative science. I mean, I think a bit of humility from the economists is called for. And there was a certain irony in my saying they're in the penthouse. You know, so I agree with that. And then on the digression about the extraterrestrials, I think, you know, they may not be there, they may be inconceivably different, because I think, you know, we should say that humans are just one type of intelligence. But nonetheless, I don't completely agree, because as I said last night, there would be a common culture in that mathematics and physics and astronomy is something that they would share. So, and in fact, there was a guy called Freudenthal who in the 1960s wrote a book called Linkos, a language for cosmic intercourse, and he showed how you could develop a language where you start with mathematical statements, etc., and build up. So I think in principle there would be something in common between any kind of entity that would be sending out signals, but it might be a rather boring conversation. It would be certainly a very slow conversation, and of course there may be other kinds of intelligence leading entirely contemplative lives and not wanting to communicate. And so any intelligence that we saw might be an atypical subset of what might be out there. The other point you make about universities, I completely agree with you. I think these league tables, they do favour certain criteria. And they have some absurd things like papers in Nature and Science being given huge weight and things like that, which is certainly they're not of huge importance. And none of these league tables really rate things that are really important, which is how much the students actually learn, the quality of teaching, how hard the students work, and any things like that. They use a lot of criteria which aren't very important, and that I think is having a bad effect, because people running universities, as we know, are motivated to try and raise their position, and this is a perverse incentive. And of course I agree with you about the bias in favour of the English language. As regards the future of universities, I don't think the present model will survive. I mean, I think I did say something in the book, and I've written a bit more about it since, that I think there will always be a market for the sort of Oxbridge Liberal Arts College system, which provides personal attention and mentoring. That can't be replaced. But I think this sort of mass university of the kind which exists in India, Italy and Germany, where frankly all the students get sort of lectures, often second rate to large audiences and nothing else, I think there's going to be far less future for that. That would be replaced by something more like the Open University model, which is a combination of you know, internet and distance learning with a local mentor. So I think there'll be bifurcation. There'll be a few sort of special institutions, rather expensive, which provide what you get in the American liberal arts colleges or at Oxbridge, and then there'll be the Open University model, or what's now called what's MOOCs, isn't that the acronym? Massive Online Open Courses, which are being developed by Stanford and MIT. So I think the typical mass residential university, I don't think will have a future. And the final point you made was about globalization. I mean, I agree again with what you say. I think the main downside is that it has not obviously benefited the poorer parts of the world, and certainly has not benefited their culture. I certainly feel we should be concerned about that, because in our world of far better communication, then they know about us, and they therefore feel more embittered than they would if they didn't know about us. And it's in our own interest to ensure that, that they can improve their own societies, not necessarily by aping us, but doing it in their own way. So I think I agree with nearly all those points. And thank you very much for reading the book so carefully.
Thank you for writing it.
Right.
So Martin,
Yeah.
both in the book and last night, you end with a discussion of the cathedral at Ely.
Oh, right.
Which I had the pleasure of visiting when I was at Cambridge many years ago. So the point you make there is that people thought the world was a few thousand, if they knew at all, a few thousand years old. They knew that the cathedral was going to take 100 years to build, and they knew they weren't going to be there for the completion of it. So that provides a certain optimism, I think, in your life, that I'm going to do this, and it's going to be available for others beyond my own existence. And so I guess the question associated with that, because I remember Bob said last night, ask a question, don't pontificate. So the question associated with that is, what's your level of optimism today for an equivalent situation? Are we building Ely cathedrals today that we're not going to be able to experience? And what are these cathedrals that we're building?
Yes. Well, of course, my implied worry is that we are not. I mean, the focus is short term, and we're making rather little provision for the low carbon economy and avoiding depredation of natural resources and all that. I mean, I think the one encouragement is that I think if you do an opinion poll of people under the age of 25, some of whom will be alive at the end of a century, you do get a greater level of concern than you do among our leaders. And so one hopes that there will be more pressure, but I think it is a genuine worry that our political leaders find it very hard to address the increasing proportion of important questions which are both multinational and long-term, because the parochial and the short-term clearly tends to trump those things on the political agenda. And I don't know. I mean, I don't know if the social scientists would agree that this is a serious worry, and we do have to make.
What's going to get me re-elected?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yes, and I mean, in fact, this is perhaps a special problem in democracy. In fact, there was an interesting article in the New York Review by Amartya Sen, who's a good friend, because he famously used to say that democracies had the advantage in that they prevented famines because there was a free press and pressure. Yes, but he then went on to say that when you look at the problems facing India and China now, they're problems of developing a proper infrastructure and long-term things. And now the Indian system is a handicap, not an advantage. And so for the only countries that are successful in having long-term plans and sticking to them are countries like China. And I think this is a genuine problem, that there does seem to be a conflict between the need for long-term planning and the electoral pressures.
You've used something like, give an example, I mean, is Wikipedia our Ely Cathedral of today, for example? Is it at that level?
Well, I think it's a wonderfully encouraging development. I mean, I think what's very interesting is that there are clearly some individuals, who are sort of geniuses in social science. They have an idea of something which most people think would never work, and it does work. And that's an example. If you said, let's have an encyclopedia, let anyone write it. It sounds a crazy idea, but it's worked. And let me give another idea which struck me, which dates back to the 1960s, I think, which is the idea of the sponsored walk or the sponsored run. I don't know when it's caught on here, where you run a marathon and you get people to sponsor you. Now, if we told people in Africa that in order to help them, we were sort of running a marathon and getting money, etc., it seems so completely irrational. They would say, why don't you just give the money? But we know very well that it works. People do get more money if they show their suffering for the cause, even if their suffering is completely irrelevant and impractical. And that's an example of something which, certainly in the UK, there was a guy called Des Wilson who ran a charity called Shelter, and that started this in the 60s. I don't know when it started here, but it's an example of something which is irrational, but nonetheless does work. And I think the most successful sort of social entrepreneurs and economic entrepreneurs are the people who have some insight into human behavior, which at first sight seems very implausible, but nonetheless works. And I think the idea of a sponsored run and the idea of Wikipedia are examples like that, where most people would have thought, when you told it, that this seems a bit irrational, but they do work. But I think, open source software is another example, and so I think there are examples where people are prepared to do something for the common good, and the question is, can we harness that and make that attitude more widespread?
Well, social media brought down the Egyptian government.
Yeah.
That was a social media event.
Yes,
First, I'm sorry I'm late. I was at your lecture last night and it was just wonderful, so thank you so much for that. I was intrigued by something you said yesterday, which was that in the future we will genetically engineer humans to be able to live outside of planet Earth in other planets or other environments. And I'm wondering how far you think we can push it based on the fact that we are, after all, made of proteins, and there are some limits as to temperatures and conditions that they won't fall apart. So what's your idea of where
well, again, I'm not an expert. I mean, it's developing fast, but I mean, every creature on Earth is made of protein, and there's such a huge variety, whether it's us or crocodiles or beetles, etc. So that fact doesn't preclude huge variations. And I think now it is possible to design, engineer the genome for some simple organism. And I don't know, but I think it's not pushing things too far when we realize how far we've got in the last 50 years to believe it will be possible to sort of design an organism, even a complex one eventually. Of course, the one issue is to what extent that will happen here on the Earth, and that's a really social question. But what I said in my lecture was that whatever we think about what the regulation should be on Earth, then we'd wish these guys good luck out in space if they're going to form a sort of separate post-human colony in using these techniques. But the other question there, of course, is are they all going to be superseded by robots? And then that's again the other uncertainty if we talk about long terms, whether there will be robots that sort of take over from humans. But that's what I had in mind. But I think the big question is going to be really, the ethical and political question is going to be what constraints we impose here in our own societies if these techniques become possible. I mean, we're seeing this in a minor way about sort of picking the sex of your child and all that stuff, but about sort of selecting in favour of allegedly positive qualities, not just against negative ones. And so I think this is going to be a bigger and bigger issue, and it's just one of the many ethical challenges which scientists are bringing to the world. And on this point, I think it's important to bear in mind the role of scientists as specialists and as citizens. To take a very old example, embryo research. I think you're never going to convince a Catholic that that's okay. And I think all that scientists can do in the debate on embryo research or abortion is to make sure that all those engaged in the debate actually know what an embryo X weeks old is like. And they don't have the misperception that a 14-day-old embryo is a sort of homunculus, etc. And we can do what we can to make sure they know what they're talking about. But if the Catholic then says, okay, I know that, but still it's sacred and you can't experiment on it, then end of story. We can't scientifically give them any argument against that. So I think scientists have a role in ensuring that the debate takes place without misperceptions about the real world. But beyond that, if it's ethics, then we have to accept that there are divergent views.
If I mean, that's a debate that can take place within one person.
Yes.
Absolutely. And am I right in thinking that's more or less what you're alluding to?
Yeah,
It's not necessarily, it is a debate.
But a scientist, of course, is a human being as well, and so they have they will have their views, and as we know, so scientists have diverse views on ethics and religion, and can still be good scientists.
For me, it's a sign of, and I see this with the way in which science communicates its processes and its results, and other areas of cultural inquiry and the arts do that. And there's a huge appetite for meaning making that lives with every person, a sense of wonder and curiosity. And I often get the idea that that seems to be excluded from the kind of mechanisms and strategies that scientists publicly discuss, where they don't necessarily, something that artists always do is they interrupt their process of explanation and say, and then I got an epiphany. It doesn't explain anything, but it piques the curiosity and the appetite for those who are listening to that story. And I think to have a discussion where the scientist would say, oh, and then I looked to the other side of my brain and I wondered what the ethical implications would be or what the aesthetic implications of it would be, and then to continue. I think there's an opportunity there.
We give better talks and write better scientific papers.
Well, you gave a brilliant example of that last night, and in the book, by the way. Quoting Woody Allen is always a good thing.
I'm just, if I can, I wasn't sure whether to raise religion or not, but you started, so here's the issue. So I mean, in the book, you make the very strong pitch that we should regard mainstream churches as our allies against fundamentalism, and that seems like a very pragmatic approach for scientists to take. But however, science is this endeavor which involves evidence and a discussion of proof and why you accept a fact and so on. And there, I mean, to pick on the Catholic Church in particular, on a regular basis, that there are claims that so-and-so should be turned into a saint because some magical things happened. So that religion is based on the idea that magic exists, which is fundamentally completely opposed to everything that you believe as a scientist. So how do we on the one hand say, but I'm happy to talk to the Pope and we're fighting against fundamentalists, but fundamentally I think everything he believes is anti-scientific. So how do I carry on as a scientist with the pragmatic approach while believing that fundamentally it's unscientific?
Yes. Well, again, I mean, I agree. I have no religious beliefs, and I don't know how any intelligent person could believe in that particular aspect of Catholic doctrine. I mean, it just seems to be unusually ridiculous. I mean, and the claims of miracle cures, you know, but I still simply observe the fact that there are many good scientists who claim to be adherents of the Catholic Church, and they may not believe the whole thing, but they support the institution for cultural reasons. I mean, I think I would give the example of lots of Jews who would claim to be atheists. They don't believe anything, but nonetheless they think it's important to light their candles on Friday night and all that for cultural reasons. And I would say I myself have no religious beliefs, but I'm, you know, pro rather than anti the church in which I grew up, which is the Church of England, and I attend that, and, you know, support its existence, etc. In the same way as the Jews would light candles. And I think one should bear in mind that religion is as much a matter of practice as of empirical belief, really. And and it's the way you think of the world, etc. And you can in many ways think of the world in slightly different ways, and it affects your attitude. Well, to take a trivial example, you treat a pet animal differently from another animal. It's not different, but it gives you more satisfaction to think the pet animal cares about you, etc. And you do that, and that's a minor way in which the facts may be something or the other, but the way you relate to that particular part of the world affects you, and that's a minor way in which some religious people are affected by the world in general. And so I understand my personal views, but I think on the empirical case, I mean, I do think that these sort of aggressive atheists who are just repeating what Bertrand Russell and people said more eloquently 50 years ago, I think they are damaging because they are alienating people who I think should be our allies against fundamentalism. And also, if you were teaching a class of kids who included some Muslims, and you tell them straight out they can't have their God and evolution, they'll choose their God and drop Darwin. And that's not good for them or for science. So that's why I do really think that the aggressive rubbishing of mainstream religion is not only insulting to many good scientists who have these beliefs, but also is counterproductive in other ways.
Good. Yeah. I'm actually, I'd like to pursue this, but bring it a little closer to your home, as it were, that is to astronomy. In your talk, and also in the book, you make, in I think, a very beautiful and enlightened way, make it clear that we're pretty puny in the universe, and when we start talking about, for example, extraterrestrial intelligence, we really have no clue what we're talking about. That the number of possibilities, as it were, is almost limitless and probably way beyond our comprehension.
Yes.
And yet, at the same time, you're very aware that some well-known cosmologists have attempted to co-opt religion into the subject. And I'm curious to know, in this regard, what really is your feeling about the anthropic principle? Because to me, it seems to fly in the face of the enlightened attitude that you very nicely explained last night. A very open attitude.
So, I mean, I'm not sure what you're referring. You're referring to people who say that the physical world is design.
Who are attempting to use ideas in cosmology to justify
design, yes.
Religion.
Yes, well, true. Some people. I mean, Polkinghorne and people do it. I mean, the argument.
Alice. I mean, there are many.
Yes. Well, the argument here is that the old Paley argument for design has not survived Darwin, but because we understand that we evolved in symbiosis with our environment. But some people still say that the fact that the laws of nature allow emergent complexity involves certain kinds of tuning, and you could imagine different laws that didn't. Now, and some people say this is evidence for design. My personal take on this is that I think it is something that should occasion some surprise, and that's why I would bet on the idea of a multiverse. Because if there's a multiverse and what we think of as physical laws are just parochial bylaws and different elsewhere, then of course there's no reason whatever to be surprised, because we naturally have evolved in a patch where the laws allow complexity. And it moves us. So I personally take this fine-tuning quite seriously, and that's why I would bet that we do live in a multiverse.
But the problem is that if we can't even, starting with the fundamental laws, which we probably don't know yet, say anything about what the universe should look like, as you pointed out last night, it's extremely difficult to starting from fundamental laws, say anything about what kind of a complex phenomena may ensue thereafter, then isn't it even less likely that we can guess what other universes might look like, not even knowing what the parameters are supposed to be that are allowed to vary?
Well, no, I mean, I think we may learn that. I mean, there are ideas about the cosmological constant and other things. So I think we may learn within 50 years about how a Big Bang might have cooled down differently. We might learn this within 50 years, okay? And then we will know, how surprising it is if you have an ensemble of Big Bangs that we have the one like we do now. I think this is a serious subject, and if you talk to Ed Whitten, for instance, he would say he believes that there are huge numbers of possible vacuum states.
Yes, but I'm not interested in Ed Whitten's beliefs, I'm interested in his arguments, and they rely on theories that don't even exist.
Well, they rely on theories that he is leading the development of, and which they may be wrong, but they may be firmed up in 50 years, just like the idea of the Big Bang was complete speculation 50 years ago.
That sounds like religion to me.
No, it is. I mean, well, you would have said the Big Bang was religion 50 years ago.
Not at all.
Yeah.
It was based on a theory for which there was strong evidence.
There was no evidence for it.
Sorry?
There was no evidence for it then.
No, but the idea was based on a theory for which there was strong evidence already.
No, not 50 years ago, not 75 years ago anyway.
Ah, you said 50.
Well, 75,
people were writing papers about the Big Bang in 1945.
Well, in the 1920s, and they were, but the evidence for it was not clear then. It was not clear until the 1960s, and so.
But sorry, we're confusing two things. On the one hand, you had a theory for which there was good evidence, that is the general theory of relativity, and consequences were being drawn from it. In 1945, the existence of a microwave background. On the other hand, we're talking about Ed Whitten, who doesn't even have a theory. He simply has hope that there will be a theory.
He does have a theory.
No.
He has an extremely elaborate theory.
But string theory is not a theory.
Well, no, it is a theory. It's just not tested. There's no way of testing it. But the hope is that it will have, if they can follow through its consequences more, that it will prove that it has consequences which we can test. If it explains why there are three kinds of neutrinos with the masses we observe and all that, then it'll gain credibility, and that's the hope. But I think one has to defer to the people like him, and it may turn out. But to go back to what I was saying, it is that I think that the fine tuning is something which is significant and would make me, in a sort of Bayesian way, guess that that Ed Whitten will turn out to be right.
But, sorry, there isn't a string theory. There's an enormous multiplicity of
There is now, yes, because it's very difficult.
So there isn't a theory. There's just lots of different theories.
Well, but let me say, it may take 100 years, but still, I'm saying that when we have a theory, I'm saying that because of the apparent fine-tuning, I would bet that it will prove to be one in which there are many possible vacua, etc., and that will remove any surprise at the apparent fine-tuning in the universe we inhabit. But just to say, this is a view, but I was on a panel with Andre Linde on this, and we were asked how strongly we took the multiverse idea, and I said, well, in the case, would you bet your goldfish, your dog, or yourself? I was at about the dog level, and Linde then said, well, he'd spent 25 years on his eternal inflation model, so he would bet his life on it. And then Stephen Weinberg said, well, he would happily bet Martin Rees' dog and Andre Linde's life.
So let me change the subject a little. So one of the things that struck me when reading the book, because I'm recently settled in Canada, is you often make a comparison between the US and Canada and the UK. Yes. So in Canada, we often like to believe that we have the best of both worlds, or the geometric mean. And certainly, for many of the things in the book, I think, in fact, the situation in Canada is better in many cases. But the one thing which we brought up earlier, in which we're worse, is science advice to government. Or maybe advice of academics in general to government. So given that that's so poor, and you're about to go back, as you said, and have a debate on the subject, is there anything we can do you think, as scientists, to improve that situation?
Other than changing the government.
Well, I was thinking that.
Yes, I don't know. Is it just one party or is it generic?
This particular.
It is a party, yeah. So, Well, throw the buggers out. That's it. Yeah, I mean, no, but I think it is true that you're intermediate. But you know, I mean, when I go to America, I do feel very much a European, and you know, the government is so alien. I mean, so what happened about, you know, the Supreme Court being able to turn down Obamacare, and this paralysis is odd. But I mean, I think there are. I think I mentioned them in. I wrote a separate preface for this, which is the American version of my book, and I think the two things I quoted were that you know, mainstream or median opinion in Europe as compared to median opinion in the US is very different on two issues. One is capital punishment, the other is guns. I mean, many are the same, but I mean, you know, the attitude of American opinion towards capital punishment and guns is something which, you know, liberal Europeans find hard to understand, because what is the median opinion in one country is way on the extreme on the other side of the Atlantic. And I think those are examples where you're probably more European than American on those two issues.
I'm just interested, Olaf, on the results of that protest, the death of evidence. This was a large gathering of scientists in Ottawa, outside our government, staged a huge walk, and they called it the death of evidence in our country. And it was, and I was just wondering, has there been any follow-on to that?
No response. Our most distinguished freshwater ecologist was the leader of the band, David Schindler from the University of Alberta. Mm-hmm. And the rest of the crowd, I mean, I would never have seen them in any kind of activist role in any other circumstance. My own previous experience of marching was in 1963 behind Martin Luther King Jr. In August, an extraordinary event. Other than that, I cannot be regarded as a great social activist. but there were similar people to myself who were protesting very vigorously, but no response. It's just a matter of ignoring.
What about the opposition? No?
Yeah.
No response there either?
No response there either.
Yes, but I mean, but what's the prep? Because I mean, I think one important point to make is that politicians, they may not respond very much to scientists directly, but if the scientists get through to the public, and the public then writes to the members of Parliament, etc., they do take notice. And so I think the question is, I mean, how does the press respond, and how does the public respond? Because if this protest resonates with the public and the major newspapers, then that will make the politicians take seriously. So
I don't think it got as much coverage as it should have.
yeah.
Letters to the editor, of course, were extensive, but there isn't quite the same tradition of acting on letters to the editor as there is in Europe.
But the post bag that members of Parliament get is very important. I mean, in Britain they're getting more letters about badgers than anything else at the moment. There's a big issue about where to cull badgers. But things like that get public attention, you know, not because of what the scientists say, but because of what the public's interested in.
Here we have skunks who just roam the streets.
Oh, right.
As you discovered.
As you said, yes, yes.
I was just going to say that the problem is much more severe under the current government. I think that if you go back to previous Liberal governments, there was still much greater separation between the academic world and the political world than one sees in Britain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so it's an enduring problem.
So that brings up the big issue of why the marchers are being ignored, etc. Ultimately, and that is the trade-off between what this current government, not my government, I guess our government, would think of as economic progress, and the impedance that would occur if we listened to some of the important findings, in particular in climate change. That's happening everywhere in the world, not just here. Maybe we're more overt, at witnessing it. But how does one make that, that leap? I'm remembering back to, to overturn that type of mentality. Does progress, and we talked a bit about economics, which, by the way, I've never thought of as a science. It's an emotion. And I think, matter of fact, it's quite anti-science in many ways. But are there any ways that you've seen in relationship to these issues where progress does not necessarily equate as having to forsake so many areas of what we consider to be important parts of our lives, such as the climate, to move forward? I mean, why is this massive rush, to progress, and where is it leading?
But I think climate issue is especially difficult because, of course, the science is uncertain, it's long term, and any country can say, well, it's not worth our doing something unless everyone else does. It is a problem. And also it's very hard to get people to agree to something if it is thought it'll lower their quality of life. I mean, I think the most optimistic thing I can hope for is that one encourages the development of clean energy and energy saving, which is a good thing for other reasons as well. And also perhaps one can change social attitudes. I mean, I think in Britain, for instance, the attitudes towards smoking and drinking and driving. And drinking and driving was sort of not frowned on nearly so much 30 years ago as it is now in British society, and I expect the same is true over here. So those are cases where social disapproval of a certain type of behaviour has hugely strengthened, and one can imagine that it might be thought sort of naff or unsocial to drive a four-wheel drive vehicle or something like that, or to have patio heaters, or do obvious things which are sort of wasteful of energy. And so there could be a change in social attitudes, and this may be driven by the fact that probably most students would take this view already, and they'll grow older, which will perhaps change attitudes and make it sort of socially unacceptable to do the kinds of things which are most damaging and most unnecessary with a view to CO2 emissions. So
every time I see a leaf blower,
yes,
I have this fantasy of my grandchild sitting on my knee saying, "Tell us again, Granddad, about how we used fossil fuels to blow leaves."
But you know that attitude about do it for other reasons, not just the grand reason that this is for the planet, to save the planet, is already happening. There's a wonderful commercial that I saw of a family, and they have all these nice green products, and the neighbors are saying, "Wow, you're so eco-friendly," and they say, "No, it's cheaper. We're saving money. We did it because we're saving money. I don't care about the planet, and I'm saving money." Going green saves money.
Absolutely.
And so it's okay. Well, then let that be the reason, and the climate will be saved in the meantime. So we've got about another half hour if everybody's still good with this. And Judith, thank you for joining us. And I just wanted, if there were other subject areas we wanted to get into, Judith, did you have something you wanted to?
Well, I had a question from last night. There was one of the questioners who asked about, well, I think what they were really trying to get at was intuition. And what role intuition plays in scientific breakthroughs. And so I wondered if you would speak to that, because there is something on the other side of our brain or something that does help us.
Yes. Well, I mean, it's certainly true that you have occasional insights at random moments, but I would guess that, as Pascal said, fortune favours a prepared mind. If one's been embedded in a subject for a long time and thought about it, etc., then one is more likely to have a well-developed intuition and then to have ideas that are good. But I think part of doing science is to develop intuition, and also in teaching science, we want to help young people to develop intuitions. And here, incidentally, computer models can. I mean, I think to take a very simple example. The simple computer programs that show you orbits and things like that, and what happens if you tweak them, and playing with that sort of thing, and watching computer simulators of other experiments does help to give people a sort of intuition into the way the world actually works, and that will help them to perhaps have the right sort of insight. But I think in science, obviously. If people have thought deeply about some subjects, they are more likely to have a good intuition than otherwise. But it's certainly true that good ideas can strike at random times.
I had a PhD supervisor who always seemed to know the answer to the question he was asking me to work on.
Yeah, I have a sort of a broader question that I've been sitting here trying to think about how to articulate in the best way. I suppose it relates to the definition of science with a capital S as opposed to sciences in the earlier understanding of knowledge, les sciences. And I am a historian. I work on cultural history specifically related to science and exploration in earlier periods. And one of the issues that I deal with quite directly is the way in which different forms of scientific understanding in its broadest possible manifestation enters into codified and established publications and bodies, institutions, and becomes seen as universal knowledge as opposed to local or intuitive knowledge. I mean, it very much follows on the previous question as well. And in listening to your lecture last night, I was struck by how, almost without really meaning to, there's a way in which our narrative of the way in which science develops tends to privilege places like Cambridge, stories of people like Galileo, Newton, Darwin, and effectively diminishes the role of all of the other broad spectra of cultures and societies that have contributed quite handsomely to this. So I'm not sure exactly what the best way to pose it as a question, but it occurred to me that we need to think about this as we inadvertently or not exclude people from the sort of larger narratives of science.
Yes, yes. Well, I mean, I think those who write popular history of science, they all adopt what you would call the Whig view of history, very much so, and they look back on the origins of those trends that survived, not the others. And of course, this underestimates the actual complexity of the way ideas evolve. But I think the other point I'd make is that I think people overestimate the so-called scientific method. I don't think the way scientists operate is any different from the way you would operate in trying to analyze a manuscript or assess evidence, or the way a detective assesses evidence. You look at the evidence, you assess the probabilities, and you weight some bits more than others, and if something is a real outlier, you may ignore it and all that. And so I don't think, in general, that the way that an experimental scientist does things, or perhaps more relevantly, the kind of scientist who does field work, is any different from what you would do if you're looking at manuscripts or trying to compare conflicting records of the same event. I think it's just a matter of deduction, assessing evidence, and putting Bayesian priors and likelihood on some of it. But there's nothing special in doing science, which is different from what you or a detective or anyone else does, in my opinion.
I'm wondering if you have any contact with historians of the history and philosophy of science and at Cambridge.
Yes, I do. Yes.
Because I don't.
With Simon Schaeffer and
absolutely.
all these people. Yeah, no, I do. Yes, and I think well, for the historians, I mean, I think that we can learn a lot from those. Philosophy of science, I'm honestly slightly more ambivalent about. Because, well, I mean, let's take quantum mechanics, which is clearly a subject where we haven't got deepest understanding, and it's clearly a mystery, etc. And lots of philosophers think about it. But if we look back at the important ideas that have clarified our view of quantum theory, they've all come from first-rate pucker physicists. Bohm, Wheeler Everett, Bell, Hartle Hawking, and Gell-Mann, and people like that. Sorry? Shimoni? I'm not so. Do you think that was important? No, yeah. I mean, I would say that they've. But I think most of them have come from people who are primarily physicists. not philosophers. And I've also, for this reason, opposed efforts to set up a cosmology and philosophy program. Because again, cosmology involves lots of philosophical uncertainties, but I think they'll be clarified by people who understand the cosmology best, not by people who don't actually understand the basic physics. So I'm slightly skeptical about the contribution made by philosophers in science, other than just clarifying and codifying the ideas, because again, the key ideas have come more from physicists.
I just wanted to put in also a plug. It's rare that I get the opportunity to be speaking to so many scientists from UBC at one time, and we have just launched a science and technology studies program in, broadly speaking, the Faculty of Arts between English, history, and philosophy. And so I hope to be able to count on collaborations across the campus, because there are far too few of them in terms of this kind of topic, especially. So, if any of you are interested, I'd love to.
And that's an example of one of these undergraduate courses that could broaden the curriculum for everyone.
Of course, the philosopher Descartes walked into a bar, and the bartender said, "Would you like a drink?" And Descartes said, "I think not." Then he disappeared. Sorry, that kills everything.
Something we haven't touched very much on is responses to climate change, and two points which you sort of briefly allude to in your book. First of all, answered the question also last night, geoengineering, and secondly, more nuclear power. Would you like to say anything more about this?
Yes. Well, here, of course, I speak as a citizen, not as a scientist. I mean, I think, to energize public and political opinion on climate change is, I think, uniquely difficult because of the uncertainties in the science, the long-term and global nature of the problem. And so what I think I briefly said last night is that what I think is going to happen is that in the next 20 years nothing much will be done. The CO2 emissions per year will go up, and therefore cumulative CO2 will go up, and there'll be some warming. But we will, in 20 years from now, we will know whether the world is on the steeply rising or the slowly rising trajectory, within the range of the IPCC report. And we will also have perhaps better models, so we will have a narrower range. Now, if 20 years from now it turns out that the change is gradual at the lower end of the range, then people will relax and they can adapt to it. If it turns out that it is happening fast, then there will be panic measures, and I think those will involve geoengineering of some kind, which of course is only a palliative and may cause more problems, and involves all kinds of legal issues and other kinds. But I think realistically that may be high on the agenda 20 years from now. As regards nuclear power, I'm in favour of it for countries which have experience of it. I think the worry we have about nuclear power is the link with proliferation, and we wouldn't want to see it spreading worldwide unless there were a much stronger regulatory regime than the current IAEA, unless there was some system whereby some international authority sort of brought the fuel at the beginning and then took it away 15 years later, or something like that. And the other point I would make is that nuclear power is an area where research really came to a halt 20 years ago. So designs that have been talked about now date from the 1960s, and they're probably not the optimum. So I would certainly support more R&D into all the options for so-called fourth generation nuclear reactors, because the ones we have now are probably not the optimum. There are new designs that are worth more thought, which are smaller scale, maybe more efficient, maybe safer. So I'm in favour of more R&D, but I'm slightly uneasy about the widespread adoption of nuclear power in the world unless there are these safeguards against proliferation. But I think more generally, I don't know if you agree, but I think the level of R&D into all kinds of energy needs to be much higher, because if you compare the amount spent on energy R&D compared to health R&D, there must be a factor of at least 20 between them. You know, new forms of energy are going to be needed for the world, and I would say we need more investment in all these options. Nuclear fusion, of course, is one, and the world is spending about $2 billion a year on fusion research. Some people say that's too much. I would say that's not too much, but given that as a calibration, then a lot more should be spent on innovative fission, solar, and all the other kinds, really, because you know, we clearly haven't got to the optimum. I mean, if you asked me to bet on the renewables, I would bet more on large-scale solar, coupled with DC grids that can transmit over long distances. You know, well, no. Do you think so? I don't. Yeah.
Eventually, we can get over the cost of getting it up there. One solar satellite can power this entire region, including Seattle.
And you get it down in a microwave beam?
Microwave or laser beam. There's a little public concern there about having a beam.
Yes, you have to carry metallic umbrellas for the yes. No, but maybe in the long run. But I think, you know, within 50 years, well, certainly in the European context, what will be talked about will be a lot of collectors in North Africa and Spain, and a grid that can transmit it across Europe. And I mean that is scalable. You can work out what area you need, etc. Whereas wind, I must say, I'm not so. I mean, what's the wind situation over here? I mean, other lots.
UBC Hydro suppress turbines, I think.
Well, you're lucky to have hydro.
So there's one.
Yes. Okay. I see. Yeah. Well, I guess you. Yes.
The situation in the UK is crazy because any farmer can get government grants to stick up a useless turbine.
Yeah, that's right.
Everybody says it's good for the environment, and therefore it's good.
No, I agree. I mean, I think it's not the answer, and you know, anything. Well, I upset some people by saying, you know, although I'm generally green, I'm not in favour of more windmills, really, because I mean, unlike solar, you can imagine solar panels being made more cheaply, etc. Whereas you can't imagine huge cost cutting in the case of windmills because they're inherently huge mechanical engineering, aren't they? And if they're offshore, then in 20 years they're going to be ruins and all that, and we're laying up problems for the future, I think. And I think certainly in the UK there was a policy to build 20,000 offshore turbines, and I'm pretty sure that's going to be scaled back.
Can I ask how it happened in the UK? I mean, was somebody not taking scientific advice? I mean, the government providing big subsidies for something which is perhaps only dubious environmental utility.
Well, I mean, they were taking advice, but I think this is a case where they were taking advice from scientists, but not from engineers. And I think they set this target in Britain to build huge numbers of offshore wind turbines without calculating just how much metal, how many barges you need and all that. And I think engineers, if they look into that, would have made them backtrack. So I think this is, going back to the question of scientists, scientific advice, we need engineers, etc., because I mean science is so widespread, and the issues involve engineering as well as science, don't they?
But we also need, what we were talking about earlier, or you were talking about last night, about cross sciences and mixing them together. I was invited to speak at 2 conferences in Toronto, which were happening in the same building at the conference center. One was the Solar Energy of Canada, and I gave a talk to them, a dinner speech. Downstairs was the Nuclear Power Association, and they were not talking to each other. They were not talking to each other. Their badges weren't even good for the other floor. They couldn't even go to the other floor. And of course the nuclear folks said, well, we're holding them up. You know, of course. But it was crazy. I mean, why aren't we? It's a total energy problem. It should be a total energy solution with cooperation. But that's not happening, at least in this country.
So did you give the same talk to both groups?
Almost. I mentioned that. I said, you know, and they knew. Yeah. But
universities can help.
Right, yes. Anyway, we're getting close to our close for time. Did you have another, Leah, did you have another question? Or?
Maybe just a quick one. You mentioned earlier that scientists are not the only people who create a body of knowledge based on evidence. But it seems to me that there have been many bodies of knowledge. You gave an example yourself, astrology. Mm-hmm. So there were centuries in which this was the science, and nothing happened until astrologers gave their predictions or said what should be done. You can even read astrology columns today in the newspaper next to serious science. Sure. So how do we ensure that these sort of quack bodies of knowledge don't become entrenched in the human?
Well, I mean, it's a social science matter. It's a matter for the press. It's a matter for the media. Astrology. I mean, I've been berated by people for not sort of campaigning against astrology. I personally feel it's not a big deal in this country or UK. If I was in India, I would feel I should campaign against it, because in India, every cabinet minister has an astrologer, and they take it very seriously. So it's worth campaigning against. But I haven't really sort of felt I should campaign against. Perhaps this is just a bit sort of lazy, but I haven't. But I think clearly there are these cultural accretions which survive, and of course, well, they're interesting in their own right. But as long as people realise that they're not the same as science. But I think science is clearly something which is the basis of our lives, but it's also part of our culture, and it's a unique global culture in that it transcends all barriers. I mean, it's just, physics, etc. is the same in all parts of the world, and obviously, and so it's something we have in common. And that also, I think, is why, if you look historically, scientists have been a fairly international community. Well, someone mentioned the Pugwash conferences and things like that. Even in the depth of the Cold War, there were bilateral links between Western and Soviet scientists, because they spoke a common language and they had common goals, and they were able to feed back to their governments and be fairly helpful. And to take a more recent example, there's a physics experiment called Sesame in Jordan, and that gets around the table people from Israel and from Iran, and there are not many other things that will do that. And so science is a way in which one can bridge the most otherwise impermeable international barriers, because it is a sort of global culture. And indeed, to go back to the other question, a cosmic culture if we meet some aliens.
So does anyone have any final comments you want to make before we wrap up? Just want to thank you all for coming here today, and thank the Wall Institute for inviting Sir Martin and bringing me here for this. It's been a real pleasure to be part of this. And Sir Martin, we can't thank you enough for giving us your time and your insights.
Well, I should thank you for inviting me here, because I've had a very stimulating experience and a chance to meet people today. It's a real bonus. Thank you very much indeed.